On a frozen July morning in the year 1030, the snow-covered fields of Stiklestad would witness the end of a dream. Here, beneath the pale Norwegian sky, two armies prepared to clash in a battle that would decide not just the fate of a kingdom, but the soul of a nation. At the heart of this conflict stood Olaf Haraldsson, a warrior king whose quest to unite Norway under the cross had made him both hero and tyrant. Against him marched thousands of his own countrymen, peasants and nobles alike, determined to crush the man they once called their sovereign. This was no ordinary medieval skirmish. This was a collision between old gods and new faith, between foreign domination and native resistance, between a king's vision and his people's will. The tale begins not with swords drawn in anger, but with the slow burn of resentment that had been smoldering across Norway for years. Olaf Haraldsson was not born to rule. He was forged for it in the fires of Viking raids and baptized in the blood of his enemies. The son of Harald Grenski, a petty king in Vestfold, young Olaf spent his youth as countless Norse warriors had before him, sailing the cold seas in search of plunder and glory. His longships cut through the waves from the Baltic to the Irish Sea, and his name became whispered in the coastal villages of England and France. But something happened to this Viking prince that would change everything. In the year 1010, in the city of Rouen, Olaf knelt before a Christian priest and emerged a different man. The warrior who had once offered sacrifices to Thor and Odin now carried the banner of Christ. His conversion was not merely spiritual but strategic. He had witnessed the power of Christian unity in the courts of Normandy, seen how faith could bind kingdoms together where blood and conquest had failed. When he returned to Norway in 1015, Olaf brought with him more than foreign gold and battle scars. He carried a vision of a unified Christian Norway that would bow to no foreign king. The Norway that Olaf sought to transform was a fractured realm of petty kingdoms and rival chieftains. For generations, the land had been carved up between Danish kings, Swedish jarls, and local strongmen who ruled their valleys and fjords like independent monarchs. The great Cnut, King of England and Denmark, cast his shadow over Norwegian politics, using bribes and threats to keep the northern kingdom weak and divided. Into this chaos stepped Olaf Haraldsson, and through a combination of brilliant warfare and ruthless politics, he carved out a kingdom for himself. At the Battle of Nesja in 1016, Olaf crushed the Danish Earl Svein, sending a message that Norway would no longer be a prize to be divided among foreign powers. One by one, the regional chieftains bent the knee or felt the bite of his sword. By 1020, Olaf had achieved what no Norwegian him had managed. King before he ruled a truly unified Norway, from the windswept islands of the north to the fertile valleys of the south. But unity came at a price, and that price was paid in the coin of his people's freedom. The Synod of Moster became the foundation stone of Olaf's Christian kingdom. Here, in a gathering that would echo through Norwegian history, the king laid down laws that would govern not just the bodies of his subjects, but their souls. Pagan temples were torn down and replaced with Christian churches. The old festivals dedicated to Norse gods were banned, replaced with Christian holy days. Traditional customs that had bound communities together for centuries were swept away in the name of religious purity. Those who resisted faced exile, death, or worse. King Olaf's law was comprehensive and unforgiving. It reached into every farmstead and fishing village, dictating how Norwegians should worship, whom they should marry, and how they should live their daily lives. The king's agents, backed by armed retinues, enforced these new Christian codes with an iron fist. Local chieftains who had once ruled their territories with the consent of their people now found themselves reduced to mere administrators of royal will. The proud independence that had defined Norwegian culture for generations was being systematically crushed beneath the weight of centralized Christian monarchy. But Olaf's enemies were not idle. Across the North Sea, Cnut the Great watched the rise of his Norwegian rival with growing concern. The Danish king ruled what historians would later call the North Sea Empire, controlling England, Denmark, and claiming dominion over Norway. Cnut understood that a strong, unified Norway under Olaf's rule posed a mortal threat to his maritime empire. If Olaf succeeded in consolidating his power, the delicate balance that kept the northern kingdoms divided would collapse, potentially threatening Cnut's hold on England king's response itself. The Danish was as cunning as it was effective. Rather than launch a costly invasion, Cnut chose to wage war with gold instead of steel. Norwegian chieftains who chafed under Olaf's harsh rule found themselves approached by Danish agents bearing chests of silver and promises of autonomy. The message was simple: help us remove Olaf, and you will be rewarded with the freedom to rule your lands as your fathers did before you. Many listened, and many were tempted. Among those who answered Cnut's call were some of the most powerful men in Norway. Harek of Jetta, a chieftain whose family had ruled the northern territories for generations, saw in Cnut's offer a chance to restore the old ways. Thorir Hund from Bjarkøy, whose wealth came from trade rather than royal favor, calculated that his interests lay with the Danish king rather than the Norwegian tyrant. Most painfully for Olaf, even men who had once served him faithfully began to drift toward the Danish banner. The year 1028 marked the beginning of the end for Olaf's kingdom. Cnut sailed north with a fleet of 50 ships, each vessel packed with seasoned warriors and heavy with Danish gold. But the Danish king did not come as a conqueror. He came as a liberator, calling upon the Norwegian people to throw off the yoke of their oppressive king. At every fjord and harbor where his fleet anchored, Cnut summoned local assemblies and asked a simple question: would they accept him as their rightful king? The answer, time and again, was yes. The ease with which Cnut conquered Norway revealed the depth of Olaf's unpopularity among his own people. The king who had unified the realm through force found that unity dissolving like morning mist when faced with an alternative. Nobles who had bent the knee to Olaf out of fear now openly declared for Cnut. Peasants who had borne the burden of Christian conversion saw in the Danish king a chance for relief from religious oppression. Even the church, which should have been Olaf's strongest ally, proved unreliable when faced with political reality. Faced with this collapse of support, Olaf made the most painful decision of his reign. Rather than fight a hopeless battle against his own people, he chose exile. In 1028, the king who had once seemed destined to rule Norway forever fled his kingdom, seeking refuge in the courts of Kiev and Rus. Behind him, he left his young son Magnus and a kingdom that celebrated his departure. Cnut's victory was complete, achieved without a single major battle. The Danish king had proven that sometimes the pen, or in this case the purse, was indeed mightier than the sword. But exile did not break Olaf's spirit. In the princely courts of distant Russia, the fallen king brooded over his losses and planned his return. He had tasted the bitter cup of defeat, but he had not abandoned his dream of a Christian Norway. Somewhere in the frozen vastness of the east, Olaf Haraldsson was gathering his strength for one final throw of the dice. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would echo through the centuries, a battle that would transform a failed king into an eternal saint. The winds of war began to stir in the summer of 1029, when news reached the exiled king that fate had dealt him an unexpected hand. Håkon Sigurdsson, Cnut's appointed jarl and ruler of Norway, had drowned in a shipwreck off the Danish coast. The Danish king's carefully constructed system of governance suddenly found itself without its key administrator. Across the frozen wastes of Russia, Olaf's eyes burned with renewed hope. The throne of Norway stood empty, and he intended to reclaim it. But Olaf would not return alone. At his side stood a 15-year-old prince, whose name would one day strike terror into the hearts of English kings. Harald Hardrada, Olaf's half-brother, was already showing the fierce courage that would make him legend. The boy had gathered 600 men from the Norwegian uplands, warriors who still remembered the old king's victories and remained loyal to his cause. These were not the soft courtiers of foreign kings, but hardened fighters from the mountain valleys, men who had never bent the knee to Danish gold. King Anund Jacob of Sweden saw opportunity in Olaf's desperate situation. The Swedish monarch had his own reasons for wanting Cnut weakened, understanding that Danish dominance of the northern seas threatened Swedish interests as well. When Olaf's messengers arrived at the Swedish court, they found a willing ally. Anund Jacob provided 400 seasoned warriors, and more importantly, guides who knew the treacherous mountain paths that led from Sweden into Norway. The route they would take was perilous, winding through the harsh Jämtland mountains where winter never truly released its grip. The journey that followed would have broken lesser men. Through snow-choked passes and across frozen rivers, Olaf's small army struggled toward their homeland. The cold bit through leather and mail, and the thin air of the high peaks left warriors gasping with each step. Many fell sick, others turned back, but Olaf pressed on with the determination of a man who knew this was his last chance. Behind them lay exile and obscurity. Ahead lay either glorious restoration or heroic death. As spring gave way to summer in 1030, whispers began to spread across Norway that the old king had returned. Farmers in remote valleys spoke of armed men moving through the forests. Merchants reported strange banners glimpsed on distant ridges. The network of spies and informants that served Cnut's Norwegian allies carried increasingly urgent messages south. Olaf Haraldsson was no longer a distant threat brooding in Russian exile. He was here, on Norwegian soil, and he was gathering strength. The news struck Cnut's supporters like a thunderbolt. They had grown comfortable in their positions, confident that the Danish king's protection would keep them safe from any threat. Now they faced the prospect of civil war, of having to prove their loyalty in blood rather than gold. The great chieftains who had welcomed Cnut's rule began to calculate the odds once more. Some wavered, remembering Olaf's skill in battle and wondering if they had chosen the wrong side. Others hardened their resolve, knowing that there could be no forgiveness for those who had betrayed their rightful king. Thorir Hund emerged as one of the most determined opponents of Olaf's return. The wealthy chieftain from Jarkøy had prospered under Danish rule, his trade networks flourishing without the interference of Olaf's Christian laws, but his opposition ran deeper than mere economics. Years earlier, Olaf's men had killed Thorir's nephew in a dispute over tribute, a wound that had never healed. Now, with the king's return, old grievances rose like ghosts from their graves. Kálfr Árnason faced perhaps the most painful decision of all. This powerful chieftain had once been among Olaf's most trusted servants, fighting at the king's side in the campaigns that unified Norway. But Olaf's increasingly harsh rule had driven even loyal men to rebellion. When Cnut's agents approached him with offers of autonomy and wealth, Kálfr had listened. Now, with his former master approaching, he had to choose between the man he had once served and the new order he had helped create. The summer of 1030 saw both sides preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Olaf's force, swollen by recruits from the eastern valleys, numbered perhaps 3,600 men. They were a mixed lot. Exiled Norwegians who had followed their king into banishment, Swedish warriors seeking glory and plunder, and local fighters drawn by loyalty or the promise of reward. What they lacked in numbers, they made up for in desperation and unity of purpose. Against them, Cnut's supporters began to gather what the sagas would call the largest army ever assembled on Norwegian soil. From every fjord and valley, they came. Prosperous farmers who feared a return to Olaf's harsh taxation, chieftains who had grown rich under Danish protection, and common folk who simply wanted to be left alone to live their lives in peace. The saga writers claimed their numbers reached 14,000, though the truth may have been less dramatic. What mattered was not the precise count, but the terrible reality that Olaf faced. His own people had risen against him in overwhelming force. By July, the two armies were converging on the Verdalen Valley, a narrow corridor of farmland nestled between towering mountains. Here, in this remote corner of Norway, the fate of a kingdom would be decided. Olaf established his camp at Stiklestad, a prosperous farm in the lower reaches of the valley. The location was both strategic and symbolic, a place where the old Norway of independent farmers met the new Norway of centralized Christian rule. The peasant army that marched against Olaf was unlike any force the king had faced in his years of warfare. These were not foreign invaders or rival nobles seeking personal gain. These were his own subjects, men and women who had once cheered his victories and celebrated his coronation. Mothers who had named their sons after him now sent those same sons to fight against him. The psychological weight of this betrayal pressed down on Olaf's shoulders like a mountain of stone. As the sun set on July 28th, both armies made their final preparations. Weapons were sharpened, armor was checked, and prayers were offered to gods both old and new. In Olaf's camp, Christian priests moved among the warriors, offering blessings and absolution. Across the valley, the peasant army prepared in their own way, some clutching Thor's hammers, others fingering Christian crosses, all united in their determination to end Olaf's reign forever. The stage was set for a battle that would echo through the centuries. On one side stood a king who believed himself chosen by God to rule a Christian Norway. On the other marched a people who had decided that freedom was worth more than faith, that independence mattered more than unity. Tomorrow would bring steel and blood, victory and defeat, but tonight there was only the terrible silence that comes before the storm. The dawn of July 29th broke cold and grey over the Verdalen valley. Mist clung to the ground like the breath of sleeping giants, and the air carried that peculiar stillness that comes before great violence. Both armies stirred in the pale light, warriors emerging from their shelters to face what many knew would be their final sunrise. The sound of steel being drawn from scabbards rang across the valley like a deadly symphony, accompanied by the murmur of final prayers and whispered farewells. King Olaf stood among his men, no longer the confident conqueror who had once united Norway through force of will. The years of exile had marked him, carving lines of hardship into his face and streaking his beard with premature grey. Yet his eyes still burned with the fierce determination that had driven him from Viking raider to Christian king. He wore his mail shirt with practiced ease, the weight of steel familiar as his own skin. At his side hung the sword that had carved his kingdom from chaos, its blade catching what little light filtered through the morning's army gloom. The king formed their ranks with the discipline of men who had nothing left to lose. Swedish warriors stood shoulder to shoulder with Norwegian exiles, their shields locked in the ancient formation their grandfathers had used to break Saxon lines. These were veterans of a dozen campaigns, men who had followed Olaf through triumph and disaster. They understood the mathematics of their situation, outnumbered 4-1, facing their own countrymen on hostile ground. Yet they stood firm, bound together by loyalty to their king and the desperate hope that courage might triumph over numbers. Across the narrow valley, a sight that would have chilled the heart of any medieval commander slowly took shape. The peasant army was vast beyond imagining, spreading across the fields like a living sea of steel and leather. Farmers who had never traveled beyond their village boundaries now marched alongside wealthy merchants and powerful chieftains. The banners of a dozen different lords fluttered above the host, but all served the same cause, the destruction of Olaf Haraldsson and everything he represented. At the head of this mighty force rode the men who had once called Olaf their king. Thorir Hund sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who had calculated the odds and found them favorable. His mail gleamed in the morning light, and at his side rode warriors whose loyalty had been purchased with Danish gold and promises of autonomy. The chieftain's face was a mask of cold determination, showing no trace of the man who had once feasted at Olaf's table and sworn oaths of friendship. Beside him, Kálfr Árnason struggled with demons of his own making. This was the man who had stood at Olaf's right hand during the campaigns that forged the kingdom, who had shared the king's dreams of a united Christian Norway. Now he wore the colors of rebellion, his sword drawn against the master he had once served with unwavering devotion. The weight of that betrayal sat heavy on his shoulders, but there could be no turning back. Too much blood and treasure had been spent to halt the machine of war now grinding toward its terrible conclusion. The battle began not with a thunderous charge, but with the methodical advance of disciplined formations. Olaf's men, knowing their only hope lay in maintaining their tight ranks, moved forward like a steel wedge designed to split the heart of the peasant host. Their battle cry echoed across the valley, a defiant roar that spoke of desperate courage and unshakable faith. Fram, Fram, Kristmenn, krossmenn, kongsmenn, forward, forward, men of Christ, men of the cross, men of the king. The peasant army answered with their own thunderous shout, a sound that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. These were not professional soldiers, but they were fighting for their homes, their families, and their freedom from royal tyranny. What they lacked in training, they made up for in sheer numbers and the righteous fury of the oppressed. As the two forces closed the distance between them, the ground trembled beneath thousands of marching feet. The initial collision was like the meeting of two avalanches. Shields splintered, spears shattered, and the screams of wounded men rose above the clash of steel. Olaf's veterans, fighting with the skill born of countless battles, carved deep wounds in the peasant ranks. But for every farmer who fell, two more pressed forward to take his place. The mathematics of warfare are cruel and inexorable. Courage and skill can achieve miracles, but they cannot indefinitely overcome overwhelming numbers. Young Harald Hardrada, barely 15 but already showing the warrior's instincts that would make him legend, fought at his half-brother's side with the fury of a cornered wolf. His sword rose and fell in deadly rhythm, each blow struck with the precision of a master craftsman. Around him, Swedish warriors who had followed the exiled king out of loyalty or greed now proverbial of battle. They'd their worth in the crook formed a protective ring around Olaf, determined that if their king must die, he would not die alone. As the morning wore on, the tide of battle slowly but inexorably turned against the royal forces. The peasant army, despite horrific losses, continued to press forward with the relentless persistence of the sea wearing down a cliff. Olaf's men, magnificent in their courage, began to show the strain of fighting against impossible odds. Gaps appeared in their formations, filled by desperate warriors who knew that every step backward brought them closer to annihilation. King Olaf himself became the focal point of the entire battle. Wherever the fighting was thickest, there stood the royal banner, and beneath it fought a king who refused to yield. His sword work was a thing of deadly beauty, each stroke perfectly timed and placed with the precision of a master. Men who had come to kill their king found themselves hesitating in the face of such magnificent defiance. Here was no cowering tyrant, but a warrior worthy of the sagas, fighting his last battle with the same skill that had won him a crown. But even kings are mortal, and the weight of numbers began to tell. A spear thrust found its mark, opening a wound in Olaf's knee that sent blood streaming down his leg. Still he fought on, leaning against a great stone for support while his sword continued its deadly work. The peasant warriors pressed closer, sensing that their enemy was weakening, their weapons reaching for the man who had dominated their lives for so long. The end came with brutal suddenness. Thorir Hund, seeking personal vengeance for his nephew's death, drove his spear deep into the king's belly. Kálfr Árnason, perhaps seeking to end his former master's suffering, struck with his sword across the royal throat. A third warrior, whose name the sagas would forget, delivered the final blow that sent Olaf Haraldsson crashing to the blood-soaked ground of Stiklestad. The death of their king broke the spirit of the royal army. Harald Hardrada, wounded but still defiant, was dragged from the field by loyal retainers who understood that the prince's survival was now more important than victory. The Swedish warriors who had followed Olaf into exile began a fighting retreat toward the mountains, their shields locked against the pursuing peasants. Of the 3,600 men who had followed their king into battle, barely a tenth would see another sunset. As the sun climbed higher over the valley, the magnitude of the disaster became clear. The field of Stiklestad was carpeted with the dead and dying, Norwegian blood soaking into Norwegian soil. The peasant army had won a complete victory, but it was a triumph that tasted of ashes. They had killed their king, broken his army, and secured their freedom from royal oppression. Yet something fundamental had changed in that valley of death, something that would echo through the centuries to come. The body of Olaf Haraldsson lay where it had fallen, surrounded by the corpses of his faithful retainers. In death, the king's face had assumed a strange peace, as if the burden of earthly rule had finally been lifted from his shoulders. The peasants who had fought so desperately to kill him now approached his corpse with something approaching reverence. Whatever they thought of Olaf the tyrant, they could not deny the courage of Olaf the warrior. But death, it seemed, was not the end of Olaf's story. It was only the beginning of a transformation that would prove more powerful than any army, more lasting than any kingdom. The man who had failed to unite Norway in life was about to accomplish in death what force of arms had never achieved. The Battle of Stiklestad was over, but the legend of Saint Olaf was just beginning to be born. The fields of Stiklestad fell silent as the last echoes of battle faded into history. What began as a desperate king's attempt to reclaim his throne had ended in blood and defeat. Yet the true victory belonged neither to Olaf nor to his enemies. Within months of his death, whispers began to spread across Norway of miracles attributed to the fallen king. His body, when exhumed, showed no signs of decay. Springs of clear water appeared where his blood had fallen. The tyrant who had oppressed his people in life became the saint who would unite them in death. Bishop Grim Kettel declared Olaf's canonization just 1 year after Stiklestad, transforming the failed monarch into Norway's eternal king. Pilgrims walked from across Europe to visit his shrine at Nidaros, and churches bearing his name rose from Greenland to Constantinople. The man who could not hold his kingdom through force of arms had conquered something far greater through the power of faith and martyrdom. The irony was complete and profound. Olaf's vision of a unified Christian Norway, rejected by his subjects in life, became reality through his death. The Battle of Stiklestad had ended not in victory or defeat, but in transformation. A king had died, but a nation's patron saint was born, proving that sometimes the most decisive battles are won not by the sword, but by the enduring power of legend itself.